seat. Thank you to Melissa. Thanks, everybody, for being here with us in the hall today, and also to all of those who are joining us online. It's really an exciting opportunity to be with you here for this celebration. Jason Bordoff this morning highlighted our interests at the Center on Global Energy Policy, not only in thinking about the 10 years of our center's existence, but even more important, focusing on the decade ahead. And that is what we will do here in this session as we focus on developing sustainable energy futures in and for developing countries. So when one looks at the context in which this conversation happens today, I think it is important to remember some of the backdrop. Today, this week, in fact, in Washington, the annual spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are underway, with profound questions about how those institutions and the countries that they serve should respond to the crushing macroeconomic challenges that have arisen during and then after the COVID pandemic, excuse me. In addition, there are questions about how those institutions and how countries such as the United States and others should respond to the needs of countries in the developing world to have energy for opportunity, for job creation, for poverty reduction, for opportunity growth. And so that's really going to be the heart of our conversation today. As I look at the countries that each of my colleagues here on the stage come from, I think about populations that are young and dynamic, with lots of opportunities, lots of challenges to be sure, and lots of ambition for the betterment of their societies. Thoughts that we all, I would think, should want to support. I'd like to start just by taking us back to the question of the Sustainable Development Goals. Damilolo Ogunbi, in your role as the Special Representative of the Secretary General, you have a special role in pursuing, in particular, the 7th Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 7, which calls for the world community to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. So we're halfway from the start of the process until 2030. How are we doing?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. The truth is we're not doing great on Sustainable Development Goal 7, and it's quite disappointing because people haven't made the link that it isn't okay to still have people in energy poverty and for some way you achieve your net zero targets. So currently we have just over 700 million people that have no access to electricity at all, and we have about 2.4 billion people who have no access to clean cooking. Clean cooking should also worry us because that causes an enormous amount of deforestation. We're doing better on energy efficiency. That could improve, and there's been a real big boost on renewable energy, but that has been in the developed world, not the developing world. You still have, in terms of investment, about 0.6 to 1% global investment on renewable energy goes to sub-Saharan Africa, which is a bit worrying because that's obviously 1 billion people. So that's where we are at now. What is important to note is that having people having access to electricity and energy is not a nice to have. It is what defines a dignified life. That's what defines if you develop. That's economic growth. And it's harder depending on where in the world you are and where you're born. So myself and most people on the stage, being born Black African, even if we're lucky enough to have access, we have about 404 kilowatt hours of access right now compared to being in the United States and living in New York and having 13,000 kilowatt hours. So it's not just about getting access to energy, it's getting access to energy that you can develop and grow. And I guess my last point that's very important is There's no scenario where we can achieve our 2050 goals if we don't achieve our 2030 goals. And sometimes people forget that, and we jump to net zero, which is truly important, or we want to get to, but we're not going to do that with so many millions of people in energy poverty.
Thank you very much for that, Damilola. And Minister Opolot, I want to ask you to pick up perhaps where Damilola just left off. Namely that one can't get to aspirations about decarbonization, net zero emissions without the achieving goals that provide sufficient energy for a population to develop. From the perspective of your work in Uganda and your government's efforts, how is the progress proceeding? Are you able, with the difficult fiscal backdrop, with a time of inflation, of energy prices going up around the globe, are you able to make headway as you would wish to?
Thank you very much for that question. As a country, we have defined strategies to overcome the challenges of electricity distribution. We have an ambitious program to actually have electricity coverage, universal electricity coverage by 2030. However, there are certain elements that have to be removed from that strategy. One, we need to actually look at how do we improve the generation of electricity. A lot of investment is going into generation of electricity, but that is not adequate to deliver it. Even if you have excess energy, you need to address the next element of the value chain, which is the transmission. How do you distribute this electricity to assure that adequate electricity, reliable, is actually reaching the communities that are the target group? Because it is the transformation of the rural poor that is extremely critical to have this access to electricity, universal access. Then we need to move to the next step, distribution of that electricity. We need to actually make it happen, and all these things require capital investment. Generation is a huge area. Uganda has got a vast resources of energy sources. We have, our energy is about 85% renewable. This is through hydro, solar. We also have geothermal. We have the wind. What we have, those vast resources of energy, is actually need for capital investment to develop them to generate the electricity. We could achieve more if we had the resources, we had the funds to develop the vast resources. But critically, currently we can say the peak demand of electricity is below than the power which is generated. That brings an interesting challenge. The interesting challenge on investment on transmission and distribution. And then giving those people adequate power other than just using it for lighting. And this is where Uganda is focusing on, using electricity for productive purposes, which would enable the transformation of the rural poor. Give them a three-phase power, which would enable them to power their small and medium enterprises at community level. How are we going to do that? Considering that the population in rural areas is sparse, we are actually thinking of going by taking a cluster approach, focusing on clusters of development centers. And that's where we are focusing the resources to cause the transformative agenda that the country is pursuing.
So Andrew Kamau, if I could turn to you next. First of all, Andrew, as was indicated by Melissa Lott in introducing him, is a recent and excellent addition to the staff of the Center on Global Energy Policy in his role as the Managing Director for International Programs of our new Energy Opportunity Lab. I hope you'll say a word or two about the EOL as you proceed. Yeah. But before that, Andrew served both in public service in his native country of Kenya, as well as in energy investing in a variety of different settings, both in Africa and elsewhere. So I'd like to ask you, Andrew, to pick up on the 2 points that Minister Opolot was just speaking about. The need for transformation of rural populations, the need for investments in particular that enable that energy for growth, for poverty reduction, and for creation of opportunity. And how do these issues look from where you previously sat in government service? And how are you thinking about those challenges as you now come to the Energy Opportunity Lab?
Thanks, John. I think one of the things that we have, there are a couple of things that get lost in this discussion. One, it's a transition. So when we look at the goals, they have to be in a step-by-step process. That's the first thing. The second thing is there's this whole discussion of access, energy access. But why are we having energy access? And the minister and Damilola have made it clear that if you just have access for access sake, all you have is somebody with a light bulb in their house, somewhere to charge their cell phone, but there's no productive activity going on. And if you don't have productive activity, there's no way you are going to be able to grow the promise of electrification. Yeah? So if you have 700 million people who don't have access to electricity, that means there are those who have, but unfortunately, even those who have the electricity have to go outside their house to cook with firewood or charcoal. I mean, that just doesn't make sense to anybody. And so we really have to think about, as we say, no, we have to go solar, we have to go wind, is it realistic? Yeah? Are those electrical appliances available for clean cooking? And if we say no, then what is the alternative? You know, Sherlock Holmes said, once you've eliminated the impossible, whatever left, however, once you've eliminated the improbable, whatever left, the impossible, whatever left, however improbable, is the truth. And unfortunately, in the case that we have, LPG is probably the cheapest way for us to go, or ethanol. Yeah? And I know people don't like hearing those kind of stories, but like I said, it's a transition. So we are not in the carbon economy yet. So as we transition out of carbon, allow us to get into the carbon economy first, reap some of the benefits, and then we can go into electrification. Because the one thing that is clear about resilience, the only way you can beat resilience, number one, is through prosperity. If you have a prosperous population, then we have the options to do other things that get us out of the carbon economy. The IEA's last report said that, and President Kagame mentioned this, that Africa's contribution to greenhouse gases is 3%. IEA's 2022 report said if Africa burnt all its natural gas reserves, we would move Africa from contributing 3% to 3.5%. You know, that's the first. And Damilola made it quite clear. She said, she talked about the amount of electricity consumed. Let me put it into a greater perspective. The average African contributes every year to greenhouse gas emission, let me say carbon dioxide, 0.4 of a ton. The average American contributes 14 tons. So I think the real story of decarbonization should be here in the US, in the global north, and the real story is development in the global south. That's what we should be thinking about.
Thank you very much for that. And if I might, please, Mr. Minister, come back.
If I could just come back. For Africa, the right way to go is integrated development of energy resources. We cannot just say, as I said, Uganda is purely clean energy, but also developing the fossil fuels. And you cannot throw away fossil fuels in the integrated approach that we should be discussing for Africa. We cannot say Africa should be hurried to clean energy, leaving the other resources that are available. So we should actually be saying, for Africa, it is integrated development of the various resources that we have to provide the energy for development for the continent.
In fact, John, just to that point, on transportation, for example, I remember when I was in the government, we decided we were going to go to newer vehicles. So right now the rule is you can't import a vehicle older than 8 years old. So we said, look, in terms of efficiency, tailpipe emissions, we were going to move to a law no older than 6 years old. There was outcry. The government is elitist. It's run by people with money. They don't care about those who want the aspiration of owning a vehicle. And at the end of the day, governments are run by people, and it's about elections. That's what democracies are about. And we had to go back to 8 years old. And it also brings us to the question of when we all go EVs, when no more internal combustion engines are being made, what happens then? Are we able to get secondhand EVs from the global north? If not, what happens?
Thank you very much. Damilola, you look like you wanted to come in on one of those points, and if so, please go ahead and do that. But I'd also like to pose a question around some of the challenges relating to the development of clean energy projects in the developing world, the countries that all across the globe that you are dealing with. I have a question that comes from our colleague, Dr. Vijay Modi, here at Columbia University, who asks, why is it easier to finance energy exports from African countries rather than supplying their own population's energy needs? So what are the difficulties, the practical difficulties, that you see countries facing as they try to develop their energy systems, be it clean energy or fossil energy systems? What are the difficulties with the internal energy system development that are the big obstacles that Sustainable Energy for All sees?
I think the first thing is sometimes we're having the wrong conversation. And the conversation isn't about the energy you generate into your power sector, which is what it's been. It's when you're asking a country to actually go through a clean energy transition or have a net zero target, that is basically the greening of the entire economy. What happens to their transport sector? What happens to their budget sector? What happens to the way they develop? What happens to their buildings? What happens to the way women cook and men cook sometimes? And I think people forget that when we're talking. So what we've been trying to do and what we've been working is what is the true cost of the energy transition? So we worked with my government, the Nigerian government, on that, and we realized that for Nigeria, or if the largest economy in Africa, to totally transition to a point of net zero in 2060, they have to get 100 million people out of poverty. They also want to have industry. All these things have to happen. It's going to cost 1.9 trillion. That is the tagline. That is assuming they're perfect policies, perfect political regimes, everything, and that is the cost. Let's say Nigeria has already budgeted some of that. That is still at 410 billion above business as usual spending. Where is that money going to come from when we have this debt distress issue? So first, I think we need to align and understand that there are many countries now on the continent that are spending easily 90% of revenue on debt servicing of interest only. So that means there's literally enough money left to pay the salaries of the civil servants. So there's no development. On top of that, you're like, oh, come and transition. And nobody's showing the pathway of how to do that. So that's one important point. If you don't know the cost of something, you don't even know how to finance it. So we're running around every COP trying to find 100 billion when one country needs 1.9 trillion, right? And that 100 billion is meant to affect all countries, and we never achieve it. But then bringing it down to the local environment. When you want to finance a project now, I don't care where you are, at least in Africa, it's going to cost you about 20% interest. If you want to do the right thing, renewable, do it well, do it clean, when it might cost you maybe 1 or 2% here. So it's not just. And if you take the option of, okay, you're going to borrow as a sovereign to the World Bank or the AFDB or any institution like that, you're looking at 3 to 5 years for something we're calling an emergency now. I don't care if it's first loss, mezzanine, all these nice words that everybody wants to say. And we should all stop lying that there's this huge pot of money somewhere that African countries can access, because it's not true. So I think we just need to be very, very honest and tell the countries, then they can now look at alternatives of what they have to do. But we can't continue saying, there's all this money, there's all of that, you just have to change your ways and your policies. Devaluation is a real thing. Interest rates are a real thing happening with these economies, and survival is a real thing. That's never really factored in when we talk about that, and that is the issue. Finance is the issue. I mean, President Kagame said here, Africans want to do the right thing. No one wants to be left behind. Nobody wants to be a second-hand market for obsolete equipment. But how do you actually do that if you don't have the money, and the institutions that are meant to help you just take so long, and you might never get it? So I think those are the challenges.
I hear your comments as being a clarion call for new tools actually to address some of these gaps that you're talking about, that you've identified, and I think that's super important. Some colleagues of ours here at the Energy Center, together with colleagues from the World Economic Forum and the World Bank, have been looking at one such niche, which is currency exchange rate risk and the ways to address that risk. We did so out of the spirit that there are new tools needed. Simply wringing one's hands and admiring the problem, entirely insufficient. So let's try to see whether there are creative ideas for what those new tools can be. Let me ask another question that comes from the audience, which relates to this, and any one of the three of you, please jump in. The questioner asks, can the panelists speak to the potential role of private equity and venture capital in energy access and energy development in sub-Saharan Africa? Are there roles for private equity, big roles, small? How do you think about that, that challenge, that opportunity? Because there are domestic pots of capital, such as pension resources, et cetera. There are also needs for some external additional capital. So how do you think about that? Minister, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I would wish to come in here. In the case of Uganda, we're actually looking at the various sources of financing, and the financing which provides an opportunity, cheaper capital, to actually invest in the transition process. And we're thinking it could be public funds, it could be equity funds, or right private sector fund. And we're thinking of creative ways of doing it. We're engaging the World Bank. We're engaging, the pension funds. We're also looking at how can we get the private sector working with the public sector, private-public partnerships. And this means engineering projects to make them available and attractive to the different investors. And the money which we are talking about, developing the electricity distribution and the network, is not money which is actually lost because electricity is not given for free. It means there is a provision within, an inbuilt provision for whatever we invest in the energy sector to get that money back, because even that smallest rural consumer will not be given electricity for free. They will have to pay. And that means if we can have appropriately affordable capital, which is invested in, there will be no money lost. The money will come back. So we need to be creative in figuring out the financing arrangements for the development of the necessary infrastructure in Africa for the electricity.
So I'd like to pose a question first to Andrew and then to Damilola that picks up on this. Some very exciting work that our colleague I mentioned earlier, Vijay Modi, and his team have been doing looking at Uganda's energy sector, electricity sector development points to some of the need for very localized solutions, development of the grid in a stepwise fashion that can help to promote the growth and this rural transformation that we were talking about earlier. So to Andrew, I mean, thinking from your previous investment backgrounds, is there a mismatch of the granular scale of energy sector development, electricity sector development that needs to happen, and the available sources of capital which tend to be denominated in, with many more zeros after the significant figure?
You know, John, you are right. There is some kind of dichotomy here where people say that capital goes to where it's most, the greatest return. And Damilola has just told you that the interest rates are 20%. Private equity firms who want to go to Africa are looking at returns of 25, you know, and they get them. They do get those returns. But the funniest thing is that there's always a question of risk. And at the Energy Opportunity Lab, one of the things that we're trying to quantify is, what is this risk? What is this perceived risk in Africa where the default is so low? And I like what they're doing in Uganda on the last mile part of it, on the granular level. And they're saying, hey, you know, we've got this parish, which is the smallest administrative block in Uganda. We will give you that block for you to do the distribution and collect the electricity. They're probably, you know, if you and I have seen these things where there's something like 15,000 maize millers in Uganda who are using diesel as generation, the power for generation for maize meal, which is the staple. And they're probably
for the Americans in the audience, that's cornmeal.
Cornmeal,
you know.
Yeah. And that's, they're paying about between 80 and 60 US cents per kilowatt hour. And we've heard that, you know, solar is down to maybe 4 or 5 cents if you price it correctly from a funding perspective. You can imagine what it does to the cost of maize meal in Uganda. I mean, that's a tangible point of it. But I just want to go back to the one point that Damilola said about real cost on critical minerals. So, you know, Africa has an abundance of critical minerals, as we heard earlier from the last discussion. But it all goes in as sand to China to make batteries. If we really calculated the carbon footprint of electric cars, and we are serious about it, because now you're transporting 2 grams per ton of a mineral by ship, which is powered by heavy fuel oil, all the way to China from Congo or Uganda or wherever. If you do the calculation, the real calculation, and this is, I think, what the representative was saying, it has a bigger carbon footprint than an internal combustion engine. And these are the things that we need to look at. And if we're serious about the energy transition, let's add value where we're mining it. Let's have real jobs where we're mining it.
Completely agree. I mean, the continent cannot just be seen as an extractive continent. I was I was telling Andrew that in my country you have a bunch of lithium mined and then sent to China and then sold back to you about 100th or 1,000th of the price. That's what's happening. So I think there is a need, and we've been working on something called the African Renewable Manufacturing Initiative, where we're taking 6 countries and say, how do you manufacture solar PV and lithium batteries in continent? It might not be competitive, but you have to start doing it. Because if you don't start, it's just going to continue. And again, what another point I wanted to make is that one of the reasons why this is not working as well is because it's not seen as a crisis. When things are seen as crises, people figure these things out. So people look at the content like it's so hard, there are all these issues. But if it was seen as a crisis, people will find a solution for it. And until we start seeing energy access with climate as a true crisis that affects millions of people, that at least 1 million African women die because they're using fuel wood, then maybe, you know, we can really come together, and maybe the funding can come together like we did when we had a COVID crisis.
I think that's a very important point, and I think others in the room share that view as well. I'd like to maybe close with a quick round of a question to each of you around the opportunities for intensified collaboration, right? We are honored to have this group of speakers with us here on the stage today. But an institution like Columbia University, other universities in the United States, other institutions that are not in the academic space, also, I think, are seeking the best and most effective ways to engage with partners in Africa. So what would you highlight? And maybe I could take it in reverse order, starting with you, Andrew, and then the, say, minister, and give the special representative the final word. So, Andrew, to you.
I think one of the things I really love what Sustainable Development for All have started to do, which is to quantify what the transition will look like in each African country. Because we go out to COP and we do nationally determined contributions, which they're nice, but they don't really get to the heart of the matter. I think that's the one thing that we could do, is put the data together, what does it look like, and then put it out into the world and say, which part can you fund?
So data.
Data.
Minister.
Yeah, there are a number of areas which we can develop in a holistic approach with the various stakeholders. In the case of Uganda, we start even with the extractives. What is it that we can do with the extractives? Let it be petroleum products, minerals, what can we do? The academia, there are a number of areas which are still gray for Africa that we need to come out clearly and come up, generate the data which can cause transformation. And then I look at the funders, it's actually being creative. What opportunities are available in Africa for the funding that doesn't get lost? The opportunities which are there for the private sector, the opportunities which are there for the World Bank. Let's have a forum where we discuss objectively to transform the energy requirements of Africa. We are for transformation. We are not stuck on fossil fuels, but we're also looking at fossil fuels as a way of generating the capital that we need to invest in the renewable energies. There are opportunities, for example, arising from the Ukrainian war, where actually developed countries went into fossil fuels. At one arm, they are using their own fossil fuels. There is an opportunity for Africa to actually use that opportunity to generate the capital which can be invested. We need investment in the energy sector, and we cannot rely on external funding. We want to have internally generated funds,
So
if given an opportunity to
investment for transformation.
Yes, investment for transformation.
Got it. Thank you very much, Damilolo.
Sorry, finally, I know we're out of time, but this working on the perception of risk, you know, and forgetting that this is a big opportunity. This is one of the few continents that's going to need more energy instead of less. That is an opportunity. and understanding that people are making a lot of money on the continent as well. And we need to bring that out and have more case studies about success so people will feel a lot more comfortable about investing into the continent and the clean energy transition.
So I love the way these 3 points that you've just ended with kind of fit together and dovetail so well. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Special Representative for the Secretary General, Damilola Ogunbi, State Minister Opolot, and Andrew Kamau from Colombia. Thank you.